"Mom, at your age, maybe it's time I started helping manage things for you." My son said it so casually over Thanksgiving dinner that for a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. I looked up from the sweet potato casserole I'd spent all morning making, my serving spoon frozen midair. Around my small dining table, everything suddenly felt too quiet. The clink of silverware stopped. Even the grandchildren, usually noisy and restless, seemed to sense something had shifted. David sat across from me in his pressed navy sweater, the one that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. His smile looked polished, practiced. Beside him, his wife Victoria slowly lifted her wine glass, her manicured fingers steady, her expression unreadable except for one thing: anticipation. I gave a small laugh, because surely this was a joke. "I beg your pardon." David leaned back like a businessman presenting a logical proposal instead of a son speaking to the woman who raised him. "I'm just saying, you've done enough. Bills, investments, property taxes, it can get confusing. I think it's time I take over before something goes wrong." Before something goes wrong. The words landed heavier than they should have. For 42 years, I had managed every checkbook, every mortgage payment, every insurance policy my late husband and I ever had. I was the one who kept this family afloat when Harold's construction business nearly collapsed in 1989. I was the one who stretched dollars, refinanced loans, and still made Christmas magical. And now my own son was looking at me like I was a fragile old woman who might accidentally lose the house because I couldn't remember where I put my glasses. Victoria finally spoke, her voice dipped in honey. "We're only thinking about what's best for you, Elaine. It would just be easier if everything went through us. Through us. Not help you. Not support you. Through us." Something cold slipped down my spine then. Not fear. Not yet. Something quieter. Sharper. I set down the serving spoon carefully. "That's thoughtful," I said, smiling the same smile I'd worn at church bake sales and PTA meetings for decades. Calm. Pleasant. Unreadable. David visibly relaxed, mistaking my composure for surrender. But across the table, I noticed Victoria's eyes flicker. Just for a second, like she was waiting to see whether I truly understood what was happening. And in that moment, I did. This wasn't concern. This was a plan. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Because the day my son tried to control my money was the day I quietly began preparing the greatest shock of his life." That night, after everyone left and the last of the pumpkin pie sat untouched in my refrigerator, I stood alone in my kitchen staring at the sink full of dishes. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. I wrapped leftover turkey in foil, wiped cranberry sauce from the counter, and moved through my usual routine the same way I had for years. Slowly, methodically, but my mind wouldn't settle. David's words kept replaying. "It's time I take over. Not help. Take over." I dried my hands on the same faded dish towel Harold used to sling over his shoulder, and for a moment, grief caught me off guard. My husband had been gone for 3 years, but sometimes the silence still felt fresh. Harold had handled big dreams. I handled reality. He built the business. I made sure we kept it. When he died from that sudden heart attack at 71, people looked at me like I might fall apart. I didn't. I met with lawyers, closed contracts, paid off debts, reviewed every investment. I learned how to manage the accounts Harold used to oversee, even the complicated ones. Our financial advisor had actually smiled during one meeting and said, "Mrs. Carter, most people half your age don't pay this much attention." I had been proud of that, quietly proud. So when David spoke to me like I was confused, like I was vulnerable, it wasn't just insulting. It felt unnatural, because this hadn't started tonight. Looking back, I could see the small changes now. Little things I'd dismissed because he was my son. 6 months ago, David insisted on simplifying my online banking. He'd set up new passwords in case I forgot. 3 months later, Victoria suggested I shouldn't drive downtown alone to meet my advisor. Traffic is stressful at your age. Then my paper bank statements stopped arriving. David said everything was digital now. Easier. Easier. I walked to the desk in my den and opened the drawer where I kept my important papers. Insurance forms, tax records, property deed. But when I reached for my latest retirement account summary, it wasn't there. I frowned. Checked again. Then a third time. Nothing. A strange tightness settled in my chest. Maybe I'd misplaced it. But I was not a woman who misplaced important things. Harold used to joke that I could find a warranty receipt from 1987 faster than most people could find their car keys. I sat down slowly in my leather desk chair, staring at the empty folder. For the first time, an uncomfortable thought surfaced. How much had David already simplified, without me noticing? Outside, cold November wind rattled the kitchen windows. Inside, I picked up the phone and stared at the number for our financial advisor, Martin Green. It was nearly 10 p.m. too late to call, but I already knew what I'd be doing in the morning. Because for the first time since Harold died, I wasn't just grieving my husband. I was beginning to wonder if my own son saw me as a mother or an opportunity. By 8:15 the next morning, I was sitting in my car outside Martin Green's office with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The building hadn't changed in 20 years. Same red brick exterior, same polished glass doors, same gold lettering that read, Green Financial and Estate Planning. Harold used to tease that Martin's office smelled like leather chairs and expensive caution. For the first time in my life, I was grateful for caution. I walked in wearing my navy wool coat and sensible shoes, the same kind of outfit no one pays much attention to. At 70, invisibility can be useful. People assume softness when they see silver hair. They mistake politeness for weakness. Elaine, Janice, Martin's receptionist, looked genuinely surprised. It's so good to see you. I smiled. I need to review all my current accounts. Everything. Something in my tone must have landed because she didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and led me to Martin's office. He stood when I entered, his expression warm but curious. Mrs. Carter, this is unexpected. I imagine what I'm about to ask will be even more so, I said, taking my seat. I'd like printed copies of every account because I was still the primary legal account holder. Martin was required to provide full authorization records once my identity was verified, every signature authorization, every recent change, and every person currently granted access to my finances. Martin's eyebrows lifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough. But he turned to his computer immediately. At first, everything looked normal. Retirement fund, savings, property tax reserve, investment portfolio. Then he grew quieter. Too quiet. He clicked again, scrolled, frowned. Is something wrong? I asked. Martin hesitated, and that hesitation told me more than words could have. After verifying my identification and account authority, Martin's expression shifted as he reviewed the administrative history. My stomach tightened. What kind of updates? He rotated the screen toward me. There it was. A secondary authorization name attached to multiple financial functions. Limited transfer rights. Administrative access. Digital oversight. David Carter. My son. I stared at the screen, certain I must be misunderstanding something. I never approved this. Martin looked deeply uncomfortable. According to these records, authorization was added through your online portal 11 months ago, along with electronic consent. 11 months. That would have been right around the time David insisted on helping me update my passwords. A strange calm came over me then. The kind that arrives when shock burns off and leaves only clarity behind. Can he move money? I asked. Martin exhaled carefully. Not everything, but enough that, under the right circumstances, significant control could be expanded. Expanded. Such a polite word for theft. I thought about Thanksgiving. Victoria's careful smile. David's rehearsed concern. This wasn't a sudden idea. This had already begun. Print it all, I said quietly. Martin studied my face for a long moment. Elaine, do you believe your son intended to deceive you? I looked down at the neat rows of numbers, permissions, and access points, pieces of my life rearranged without my full understanding. Then I answered with the only truth I had. I believe, I said softly, that my son is counting on me to stay the woman who never questions him. I lifted my eyes. But that woman buried my husband 3 years ago. I drove home from Martin's office with a folder full of printed statements sitting on the passenger seat beside me, heavier than paper had any right to feel. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call David. And for once, I didn't try to explain away what I had seen. The November sky hung low and gray over Cedar Grove, the kind of sky Harold used to call truth-telling weather. Cold enough to strip things bare. Honest enough to show what was still standing when everything decorative fell away. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the maple tree Harold planted when David was 10 had lost nearly all its leaves. Its branches stretched dark and exposed against the sky. Somehow, that felt fitting. I sat in the garage longer than necessary, both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead while Martin's words replayed in my mind. Administrative access. Authorization history. Digital oversight. Not theft. Not yet. But not innocence either. When I finally walked inside, the house greeted me the way it always had. Quiet, familiar, filled with the scent of cinnamon from the candle I'd left burning that morning. Yet something felt different now. Not in the house. In me. I carried the folder straight to the kitchen table Harold built with his own hands the summer David left for college. That table had seen birthday cakes, unpaid bills, college acceptance letters, cancer scares, and retirement plans. Harold used to joke that if we could testify, ours would need legal representation. For the first time, that didn't feel like a joke. I opened the documents carefully, page by page. Account summaries, access permissions, notification changes. And there, buried beneath technical language and digital preference updates, was the detail that made me stop breathing for a moment. Primary communication routing had been changed months ago. Certain financial alerts were no longer coming directly to me. They were being filtered through David's email. I read it twice, then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did. This wasn't a son occasionally helping his widowed mother. This was structure. I leaned back slowly, staring toward the kitchen counter where Harold's old white coffee mug still sat near the sink, its chipped handle unchanged despite everything else life had taken. Harold had always believed in preparation. After years of watching business partners lose companies, properties, and even family relationships to probate battles and careless estate planning, he became meticulous about layered legal protection. At the time, I thought he was simply being practical. Now, sitting there with proof that our son had quietly positioned himself between me and my own financial visibility, I began to wonder if Harold had been preparing for more than market crashes and tax law. Suddenly, memories I'd dismissed began resurfacing with uncomfortable clarity. David insisting on helping me streamline online access after my cataract surgery. Victoria reorganizing my office while I recovered. A missing folder I had blamed myself for misplacing. That conversation last spring when David casually mentioned how peaceful an assisted living community could be. Back then, I heard concern. Now, I heard rehearsal. A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with November. I stood, walked upstairs, and opened Harold's side of the closet. His flannel shirts still hung untouched. His old fishing jacket still carried the faint scent of cedar and winter air. On the top shelf sat the cedar box where he kept our original estate papers. The one he once told me was for storms we hope never come. With slower hands than I cared to admit, I lifted it down. Inside were insurance policies, property deeds, our original will, and an envelope I had never seen before. My name was written across the front in Harold's unmistakable handwriting. Elaine, if anything ever starts to feel wrong. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed. Outside, bare branches scraped softly against the window. Inside, 42 years of marriage suddenly felt less like memory and more like a message still unfolding. Because deep in my bones, before I even opened that letter, I already knew. Harold hadn't just spent his life building security for us. He may have quietly prepared for the day I'd need protection from someone we both loved. My hands were steadier than I expected as I unfolded Harold's letter. After 42 years of marriage, I knew his handwriting the way I knew my own reflection. Strong, deliberate, no wasted motion. The first line alone made my throat tighten. Ellie, if you're reading this, then something doesn't feel right, and I need you to trust that feeling. I sat perfectly still. Outside, the wind rattled the bedroom windows, but inside, the world seemed to narrow to that single page in my hands. Harold went on to explain something I never knew. About a year before his heart attack, after watching one of his business partners get manipulated by his own children during a medical decline, Harold had quietly updated parts of our estate structure. Not because he distrusted David, but because, in his words, money can change how people measure love. My chest ached reading that. There were accounts I already knew about, of course. Retirement, savings, investments. But Harold had created something else. One of several layered estate protections Harold had quietly established after updating our legal planning, one I hadn't activated because he believed I'd only need it if someone, anyone, including family, attempted to pressure, manipulate, or improperly gained control over my primary assets. I read that paragraph twice, then 3 times. Attached was Martin's name, legal instructions, and one handwritten sentence underlined twice. If anyone, including David, ever treats your security like an opportunity instead of a responsibility, do not explain. Act. I covered my mouth with one hand. Not because I was crying. I wasn't. Because suddenly, my husband felt very close and heartbreakingly right. Inside the envelope was also a small key. Brass. Simple. I recognized it immediately. Safety deposit box. First National Bank. The one Harold had told me was for worst-case scenarios. Then smiled and said he doubted we'd ever need it. By noon the next day, I was sitting in a private room at the bank while a manager placed the box in front of me. Inside were original trust documents, legal amendments, copies of property protections, and one detail that made my pulse slow instead of race. If coercion or financial exploitation by a direct heir was legally documented, that heir's inheritance rights could be significantly reduced or redirected entirely at my discretion. I stared at the papers, suddenly understanding why Harold had always insisted that true protection didn't come from money. It came from preparation. David thought he was gradually stepping into control. What he didn't know was that the moment I chose to act, I could legally step him right back out. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I didn't feel confused. I felt focused. I asked for copies of everything. Updated copies. Secure copies. Then I made one more appointment. Not with David. With an elder law attorney Harold trusted, but David had never met. Because this was no longer about hurt feelings or disrespect. This was about strategy. My son believed age had made me easier to outmaneuver. But he had forgotten something dangerously important. I had spent 4 decades building a life beside a man who prepared for storms. And Harold had quietly made sure that if our own son ever became one, I would be the safest house standing. 3 days later, I sat across from Patricia Holloway, the elder law attorney Harold once called the smartest woman in 3 counties. By the end of our first hour together, I understood why. Patricia wasn't warm in the way people expect older women to be. She was sharp, controlled, the kind of woman who didn't waste words because she didn't need to. Her silver bob was immaculate. Her reading glasses rested low on her nose, and by the time she finished reviewing Harold's documents, Martin's printouts, and my account changes, she removed those glasses very slowly. That, she said, tapping David's unauthorized access trail with one polished fingernail, is not retirement planning. Taken individually, these changes might appear helpful. Taken together, this resembles strategic positioning. I felt something strangely comforting in hearing another person say it plainly. Not confusion, not overreaction. Positioning. Patricia explained that while David had been careful, painfully careful, he'd built himself a framework. Incremental permissions, communication reroutes, digital dependency, the kind that could, over time, make a woman look less capable on paper than she actually was. And once enough of that narrative exists, Patricia said, suggesting assisted living, conservatorship, or financial relief becomes much easier. My stomach turned. Not because I didn't believe her. Because I did. Suddenly, David's comments over the past year sounded different. Mom, let me simplify that. Mom, you don't need to worry about this anymore. Mom, wouldn't it be nice to have less responsibility? They hadn't been random kindnesses. They'd been bricks. And brick by brick, my independence had been quietly reframed as burden. Patricia folded her hands. The good news is, Elaine, your husband was exceptionally thorough. I almost smiled at that. Harold would have loved hearing it. She then outlined our next steps, each one precise. First, revoke and replace all digital permissions immediately, but not publicly. Second, reroute every financial notification back to a private, newly secured email David didn't know existed. Third, conduct a forensic review of the previous 11 months. Every login, every authorization, every attempted transfer. And fourth, do nothing that alerts him yet. I looked up. You want me to pretend I know nothing? Patricia's expression didn't change. I want him comfortable. Comfortable. There it was again. That same lesson life had apparently been trying to teach me from multiple directions. People reveal the most when they believe they've already won. So I nodded. For the next several weeks, I played my role beautifully. I thanked David for helping. I let Victoria explain budgeting apps over coffee as though I were learning something revolutionary. I even smiled when David suggested maybe I should eventually downsize. All while Patricia quietly rebuilt the walls around my life. Passwords changed. Legal protections activated. Property structures fortified. Backup trustees assigned. And then came the real discovery. During the forensic review, Patricia found attempted access to my home deed records twice. Not completed, but searched by someone using David's authorization profile. I stared at the report in silence. My son wasn't just watching my money anymore. He was looking at my house. The home Harold built. The kitchen where I raised him. The front porch where he took his first steps. And in that moment, something inside me changed. I was no longer a cautious widow protecting herself. I was a mother finally seeing the difference between love and entitlement. The hardest part wasn't uncovering what David had been doing. It was sitting across from him every Sunday dinner, pretending I still didn't see it clearly. By mid-December, Cedar Grove looked like something printed on a holiday card. Fresh snow-dusted porch railings. Wreaths hung on front doors. White lights glowed from tidy windows, and everywhere I turned, people smiled like family was the safest place on earth. I smiled too. That was the useful thing about being a 70-year-old woman no one expected to change. People rarely notice when you stop being naive, as long as you remain polite. Mom, you know the housing market's still strong, David said one Sunday evening while slicing roast chicken at my kitchen table. If you ever wanted to downsize, this would honestly be the smartest time. There it was again. Downsize. Not if. When. Victoria dabbed her mouth delicately with a linen napkin and gave me that same polished expression she always wore when packaging pressure as compassion. You deserve less responsibility, Elaine. Imagine somewhere beautiful, an assisted living community with privacy, activities, no maintenance. It could actually give you freedom. Freedom. Such an interesting word when spoken by people slowly trying to control your choices. I smiled gently and took a sip of water. I'll think about it. And just like that, David relaxed. That had become his tell. Every time I appeared agreeable, he softened. His shoulders dropped. His tone grew more confident. He still believed cooperation meant trust. He had no idea cooperation had become observation. 2 days later, I met Martin again, this time in a quiet cafe 30 minutes outside Cedar Grove, at Patricia's recommendation. Never underestimate proximity, she told me. People talk, especially in small towns. Martin arrived carrying a slim leather portfolio, not dramatic, just organized, which somehow felt more dangerous. Inside were documented account access records, authorization timelines, and property inquiry logs tied to my financial review. Not assumptions, not accusations. Records. And records have a way of stripping emotion out of denial. Together, we reviewed nearly a year of digital activity. Password modifications, notification reroutes, administrative expansions. Most changes, standing alone, looked practical enough to excuse. But layered together? A pattern. Then Martin quietly turned one page toward me. For months earlier, using his authorized profile, David had accessed projected estate liquidity documents connected to property valuation scenarios, including my home. Not sold, not transferred, but evaluated. I stared at the page for a very long time. The house Harold built. The porch where David learned to ride a bike. The kitchen where I packed his school lunches for 12 years. He hadn't taken anything yet, but he was looking. And sometimes, looking tells you enough about where someone hopes to go. That night, I walked out to Harold's workshop behind the house. The air smelled like pine and frost. His tools still hung in perfect order, every hammer and level exactly where he'd left them. Harold believed preparation was a form of love. Build it right before storms come. I stood there for nearly an hour before I noticed an old ledger box tucked behind a lower shelf. Inside were business files, receipts, and 2 sealed envelopes. One addressed to me, one addressed to David. Mine was brief. Ellie, if David ever begins measuring your worth by what you own instead of who you are, do not confuse protecting him with protecting the family. I closed my eyes. Not because I was shocked anymore. Because piece by piece, Harold's caution was beginning to feel less like suspicion and more like wisdom earned from watching how quickly money could distort love. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I stopped asking myself how this had happened. And I started asking something far more useful. What was David expecting next? The answer came quickly. Christmas Eve. He had already insisted the whole family gather at my house this year. Victoria was planning decor. David had casually mentioned we could finally simplify a few estate details before the new year. Simplify. I almost laughed. Instead, I called Patricia the next morning. By Harold's prior recommendation, I scheduled what appeared entirely ordinary, a year-end estate document review for after Christmas dinner. Professional, private, plausible, no ambush, no scene, just timing. Because if my son intended Christmas Eve to be the night, he quietly moved one step closer to controlling my future. Then Christmas Eve would also be the night he discovered his mother had spent the last several weeks doing something he never once imagined. Preparing first. Christmas Eve arrived under fresh snow and perfect manners. Cedar Grove looked beautiful that night. Porch lights glowed gold against white lawns. Church bells carried through the cold air. My maple tree shimmered softly beneath the lights Harold and David had once strung together when David was 14, back when ladders, laughter, and Christmas still felt uncomplicated. From the outside, my home looked exactly as it always had. Warm, safe, festive, and for the first time in my life, I understood how deceptive appearances could be. Inside, I set the table with my mother's china, Harold's silver, and the red linen napkins reserved for holidays. Victoria had insisted on updating the centerpiece with sleek white orchids and crystal candle holders that looked more like a hotel lobby than Christmas, but I let her. Tonight was not about decor. Tonight was about observation. David arrived smiling, carrying an expensive bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet and a bakery box tied with gold ribbon. Victoria followed in cashmere and polished charm. The grandchildren burst through the front door in scarves and boots, bringing the kind of joy only children can create without effort. For a few hours, it almost felt real. Prime rib was carved. Glasses clinked. Mason laughed so hard at dinner he nearly spilled his cider. For brief moments, I even let myself grieve what this night might have been if suspicion had never entered it. But truth has a way of sitting at the table, even when no one names it. I wore emerald green that evening, Harold's favorite color on me. Not for sentiment, for steadiness. Dinner passed beautifully. Too beautifully. Victoria complimented everything a little too carefully. David refilled my wine glass a little too often. Their kindness had the polished precision of people working toward timing. And eventually, timing arrived. Once dessert plates were cleared and the children disappeared upstairs with new gadgets, sugar, and Christmas movies, David leaned back in his chair and gave me that familiar, practiced smile. "Mom," he said lightly, reaching for his leather portfolio near the dining room sideboard. "Before the new year gets hectic, I brought those estate simplification documents we talked about. Nothing major, just a few practical updates." There it was. Simplification. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. "Oh, good," I said warmly. Perfect timing. For the first time all evening. Victoria's smile hesitated. David paused. "What do you mean?" I rose calmly from the table, crossed into the study, and returned with my own organized folder. Not dramatic, not theatrical, prepared. "Because before I sign anything," I said pleasantly, "Patricia Holloway is stopping by tonight for my year-end estate review. Harold always preferred we close important matters before January." David blinked. Not panic. Not yet. But disruption. "Patricia?" Victoria asked too quickly. "Yes," I said, taking my seat again. "Harold's elder law attorney. She should be here shortly." And right on cue, the doorbell rang. Not like fate. Like scheduling. I smiled. That'll be her. No one moved at first. Then I stood, opened the door, and welcomed Patricia inside. Elegant, composed, carrying. Nothing more threatening than a structured leather briefcase and 30 years of legal precision. "Apologies for interrupting Christmas," she said graciously. "Elaine and I scheduled a brief year-end document execution." Execution. Such an innocent word, until it isn't. David's confidence didn't vanish. But I watched it shift. Patricia joined us in the sitting room, not the dining table, because this was never about spectacle. It was about process. Professional, documented, undeniable process. David handed me his papers first. Signature tabs. Helpful notes. Administrative recommendations. I passed them directly to Patricia. Then she opened mine. Revocation of expanded digital permissions. Restoration of private financial routing. Execution of pre-existing trust protections. Harold had legally established years ago. And finally, conditional inheritance review under documented financial exploitation. No shouting followed. No dramatic accusations. Just the quiet, devastating sound of paperwork being understood. Victoria went pale first. David didn't speak at all when Patricia slid documented property inquiry logs beside his proposed simplification forms. Because suddenly, the conversation was no longer theoretical. It was comparative. What he requested, what he had already explored, and what Harold had already prepared for. Upstairs, my grandchildren laughed at some animated Christmas movie. Downstairs, snow fell softly outside the windows. And in my sitting room, my son began realizing that while he had spent months quietly preparing to step further into my life, I had quietly prepared first. No one spoke for what felt like a full minute. Not even the children upstairs. It was strange how silence could become its own kind of thunder. David sat motionless. Patricia's documents spread before him like evidence in a courtroom he never expected to enter. His expensive watch caught the glow of the Christmas chandelier as he slowly turned another page, then another, each one stripping away a little more certainty. Victoria was the first to break. "This is ridiculous," she said with a brittle laugh, though her voice had lost all warmth. "Elaine, you're acting like we were trying to do something wrong." I folded my hands in my lap. Calmly, "No," I said. "I'm acting like I finally paid attention." David looked up then, and what struck me most wasn't anger. It was offense, as though my awareness itself had betrayed him. "Mom," he said, lowering his voice into that patient, corporate tone people use when they think emotion belongs to someone less rational. "You're misunderstanding this. We were trying to protect you. This was about making things easier." Easier. There it was again. That polished little lie wrapped in concern. I glanced at Patricia, who had remained quietly seated near the fireplace, composed as winter steel. She hadn't said a word yet. She didn't need to. Her presence alone had altered the power in the room. I reached for one specific page and slid it across the table toward David. "Forensic login history," I said softly, "including deed searches, liquidity projections, access timestamps." Victoria's face drained so quickly it was almost fascinating. David's jaw tightened. "I can explain that." "I'm sure you can," I replied. "What I'm interested in is whether you can explain it honestly." Upstairs, one of my grandsons burst into laughter at some game, the innocent sound floating down the staircase like a reminder of what family should feel like. David leaned back hard in his chair. "You had me investigated?" There it was. Not guilt. Indignation. I almost pitied him then. Almost. "No," I said. "I protected myself." Patricia finally spoke, her voice precise and devastatingly calm. "To be clear, Mr. Carter, your mother exercised lawful review after discovering unauthorized structural positioning regarding her financial autonomy. She has chosen not to pursue formal exploitation claims at this time." At this time, Victoria's hand flew to David's arm. "David," he pulled away. For the first time, I saw panic begin to outpace performance. "This is insane," he snapped. "I'm your son." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were powerful, but because once upon a time, they would have been enough. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said, "which is why this hurts more than it should." The room went still again. Then I opened Harold's final letter. The one addressed not to me, but to David. "I think your father deserves to join this conversation," I said. David's expression changed instantly. Not confidence. Not irritation. Fear. Real fear. Because for the first time all evening, my son understood this wasn't just about paperwork. This was about legacy. And Harold Carter had apparently left behind more than money. He had left behind judgment. You could hear the furnace humming beneath the floorboards. That low, steady winter sound Harold always said made a house feel dependable. And in that moment, it was the only thing in the room that still did. Patricia sat quietly in the armchair near the fireplace, her briefcase closed now, her work laid out plainly enough that no dramatic speech was necessary. The documents already spoke. David stared down at the pages in front of him, his proposed estate, simplifications, on one side, Harold's pre-existing protections on the other. For the first time all night, my son looked less like a polished financial strategist, and more like a man realizing he may have misunderstood the very woman sitting across from him. Victoria broke first. "This is absurd," she said sharply, though even she sounded less certain now. "Elaine, you're acting like David was trying to steal from you." Patricia didn't flinch. I did not raise my voice. No, I said calmly. I'm acting like I finally reviewed what was being positioned around me. David exhaled hard and pushed back slightly from his chair. Mom, come on, he said, his tone shifting quickly from polished to defensive. You're twisting this. I was trying to protect you. Things get complicated. Taxes, property, long-term planning. I was stepping in before something went wrong. There it was. The argument he had likely prepared long before tonight. Helpful, responsible, practical. But this time, I had paperwork too. Patricia slid one specific page toward him, documented account access records, administrative expansions, and property valuation inquiries tied to his profile. Not illegal on their own, but no longer invisible either. David's jaw tightened. I can explain that. And perhaps he could have. A month ago, I might even have let him. But then I reached for the final envelope from Harold's cedar box. The one addressed to David. The room changed then, not theatrically, not loudly, but unmistakably. Victoria stopped talking. Even David's anger seemed to hesitate. I held the letter out. Your father believed in clarity, I said. So do I. David took it slowly. His hands weren't shaking exactly, but they were no longer steady either. He unfolded the page, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of paper. David, if you are reading this, then your mother has likely been put in the position of questioning whether your intentions honor her or merely account for her. David's face changed immediately. Not collapse. Not yet. But resistance met recognition. He kept reading. I built what I built so your mother would never confuse dependence with love. If you are pressuring her to surrender autonomy in the name of convenience, then you are not protecting her. You are measuring her. Victoria's breath caught audibly. David looked up then, anger flashing for one final moment. This isn't fair, he snapped. Dad didn't know what things would be like now. But even as he said it, the words sounded thinner. Because Harold had not predicted the future. He had understood character. Keep reading, I said. David swallowed hard. If greed ever convinces you that access is the same as responsibility, then money will not be your greatest inheritance lost. Character will be. Silence. Real silence. The kind no one can talk their way out of. David sat back slowly, and this time when he looked at me, he no longer looked offended. He looked ashamed. Not because I had embarrassed him. Because for the first time, he could clearly see the difference between stewardship and entitlement. Patricia then opened the final legal page. Under provisions Mr. Carter established years ago, she said evenly, Mrs. Carter has now executed existing trust protections. All expanded administrative assumptions are void. Future inheritance distribution remains discretionary and may be redirected under documented financial exploitation concerns. David blinked. Redirected where? I answered that myself. To your children's protected education funds, I said. Veterans housing. And women recovering from financial exploitation. Victoria looked stunned. David looked devastated. And perhaps that was the true consequence. Not losing immediate control, but realizing his father had built a legacy designed not simply to transfer wealth, but to reveal who deserved to carry it. I folded my hands in my lap and looked directly at my son. You were never entitled to manage what you did not build, I said quietly. And love does not become trustworthy simply because it calls itself family. Outside, snow continued falling over Cedar Grove. Upstairs, my grandchildren laughed at a Christmas movie. And downstairs, beneath twinkling lights and 40 years of family history, my son finally learned that the greatest shock of his life was never going to be losing my money. It was discovering I had never been nearly as easy to outmaneuver as he believed. No one asked for dessert after that. The pecan pie sat untouched beneath its glass dome. The bourbon whipped cream Victoria had proudly brought from that overpriced bakery in Fairfield remained slowly softening on the counter, unnecessary now, like so many other carefully curated things that evening. Christmas music still played from the living room speakers. Bing Crosby crooning about a white Christmas while my family quietly unraveled around my dining room table. It would have been ironic if it hadn't been so deeply sad. David didn't yell. That surprised me most. For a man who had spent the better part of a year quietly positioning himself, I expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even blame. Instead, he looked hollow, like someone who had built an entire version of the future in his head and was suddenly watching it collapse in real time. Victoria, however, was not nearly as restrained. Elaine, this feels cruel, she snapped, standing so quickly her chair scraped harshly against hardwood. In front of the children? On Christmas. I looked at her for a long moment. Really looked. And for the first time, I know. Longer saw the polished daughter-in-law who hosted perfect brunches and color-coded holidays. I saw ambition, panic, calculation cracking under pressure. No, I said quietly. Humiliation would have been signing away my life while pretending it was love. That landed. Hard. David closed his eyes briefly, like the words physically hurt. Perhaps they did. The grandchildren began drifting downstairs then, curious in that cautious way children get when adults have shifted from festive to fragile. My oldest grandson, Mason, paused on the staircase, his new tablet still in hand. "Dad," he asked softly. And something about that single word, that innocent, confused little word, seemed to pierce David deeper than Harold's letter ever could. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about me watching my son. It was about his children watching him. David stood slowly. His voice, when it came, was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Kids, go put your coats on. We're leaving." Victoria turned sharply. "David, we're leaving," he repeated, and this time, there was no polish left. Only shame. The children obeyed, subdued and silent. As my grandchildren gathered their things, Mason looked back at me. "Grandma, are you okay?" Oh, that nearly broke me. Because through all of it, the paperwork, the betrayal, the strategy, that sweet boy's concern was the purest thing in the room. I smiled at him, the real kind this time. "I will be," I said. David stopped at the doorway before stepping out into the snow. His hand rested on the brass knob Harold installed 25 years ago. "Mom," he didn't finish. Maybe because there are some apologies too unfinished for language. Or maybe because, for the first time, he understood that forgiveness and consequences are not opposites. I nodded once. Not cruelly. Not warmly. Just clearly. Then he left. And just like that, the front door closed behind my son, my daughter-in-law, and the illusion I'd been living under for far too long. The house became quiet again. But this silence felt different. Not empty. Honest. Patricia gathered her briefcase. Martin gave me a respectful nod before leaving. Soon, it was just me, standing beside the Christmas tree, watching white lights blink against decades of family ornaments. Baby handprints. School photos. Homemade angels. Proof that love had been real here. Even if somewhere along the way, greed had tried to move in beside it. I picked up Harold's coffee mug from the kitchen and stood by the window, watching snowfall cover the driveway where David's car had disappeared. Then I whispered the truth I think my husband had known all along. Loving your child does not mean protecting them from becoming someone you no longer recognize. Sometimes, love means letting consequences introduce them to themselves. By New Year's Day, Cedar Grove was buried beneath 12 inches of snow. The kind Harold used to love. He'd wake before sunrise, pour coffee into that chipped contractor's mug, and stand at the front window grinning like a boy every time the world turned white overnight. He always said snow had a way of forcing everything still long enough for people to finally see clearly. For the first time since he'd been gone, I understood exactly what he meant. The week after Christmas was quieter than any I could remember. David didn't call. Victoria didn't text. There were no polished apologies. No defensive explanations. No carefully crafted stories about misunderstanding. Just silence. And surprisingly, I didn't fear it anymore. Because silence, I had learned, is only painful when you're still begging something false to become true. I wasn't. With Patricia's help, everything was finalized by mid-January. My accounts were secured. My trust fully activated. My home legally protected beyond manipulation. New educational funds were established for my grandchildren. Funds no parent could redirect. Harold's charitable wishes were honored too. Veterans housing, widowed women rebuilding financial independence, and local scholarship programs. For the first time in years, my money felt like what Harold and I had always intended it to be. Not bait. Not power. Protection. Then, sometime in February, David came alone. No Victoria. No briefcase. No strategy. Just my son. He stood on my porch looking older somehow. Not physically. Morally. Like consequence had a way of aging a man faster than time ever could. "I don't expect you to forgive me today," he said before I even invited him inside. "Maybe not ever. But I need you to know, Dad was right. I started measuring things I never should have. I said nothing at first, because this time, I needed his words to exist without rescuing him from them. So I let him stand there. Let him feel winter. Let him feel honesty. And for once, he did not look away. We talked for 2 hours that day. Not as a mother desperate to believe. Not as a son trying to persuade. Just two people sitting in the wreckage of choices, deciding whether anything honest could still be built from it. Healing did not arrive dramatically. It came slowly. Boundaries. Accountability. Distance where needed. Effort where earned. Victoria never truly repaired things with me. Some fractures come wrapped too tightly in pride. But David, over time, began doing something far rarer than apologizing. He changed. Not perfectly. Not instantly. But genuinely. And that, I realized, was Harold's final gift. He had not built traps for our son. He had built truth. A line in the snow. A mirror. A choice. Years later, when my oldest grandson left for college using the education fund his grandfather protected, he hugged me in my driveway and said, "Grandma, because of you, Dad became a better man." I smiled, though my eyes burned. Because that was never the revenge. The revenge would have been destruction. This was something better. Revelation. I still live in the same house. Harold's maple tree still turns gold every fall. His mug still sits by my sink. And every Christmas Eve, I set the table with my mother's china, light candles, and remember the night I stopped confusing love with surrender. My son once thought my age made me easier to control, but he forgot something vital. I was the woman who survived loss, built stability, protected legacy, and finally learned that being a good mother does not mean handing over your power just because someone calls themselves family. Sometimes the greatest gift a mother can leave behind is not her money. It's the moment her children finally understand that love, without character, inherits nothing.